The Apex Verification Complex stood as a monument to what happened when bureaucratic anxiety, unlimited funding, and a pathological fear of temporal paradoxes achieved perfect synthesis. Suspended in a carefully stabilized pocket of spacetime between 6 different temporal jurisdictions, it represented the galaxy's most ambitious attempt to create foolproof security by making the approval process so complicated that most threats would simply give up and find easier targets. The Temporal Quantum Scar Analyzers, TQSs, to those who valued their pronunciation abilities, didn't just examine physical injuries like their primitive predecessors. These marvels of over-engineered paranoia could read the actual temporal echoes embedded in scar tissue, analyzing the precise moments when traumatic events had occurred with what their manufacturers smugly called chronological certainty. The manufacturers had clearly never processed a human. Security Director M.Y. Exthol drifted through his command center with the satisfied fluidity of someone whose species had evolved from sentient gas clouds and never quite gotten over the convenience. His form, a constantly shifting mass of luminous vapor contained within a roughly humanoid environmental suit, rippled with patterns that indicated professional contentment as he monitored the 14 different temporal scanning systems currently tracking incoming applicants to Processing Bay Gamma. Today's schedule was refreshingly predictable. Altarian historians seeking permits to excavate pre-warp ruins, Centauran archaeologists with their insufferable habit of filing paperwork in mathematical proofs, and one human xenoarchaeologist from the Terran Archaeological Consortium requesting clearance to study temporal anomalies in the Kepler sector. Lieutenant Cole Vanguard emerged from the temporal stabilization chamber with the casual efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate bureaucracy without losing his sanity or his sense of humor. He was built like someone who'd spent considerable time in hostile environments without developing an unhealthy paranoia about them, with sandy hair that looked like it had been styled by practical necessity rather than fashion considerations, and eyes that held the particular quality of having witnessed enough temporal anomalies to find them mildly interesting rather than existentially terrifying. The preliminary scans, basic chronometer readings that checked for temporal displacement and paradox contamination, cleared him without incident. Standard archaeological credentials, no unusual temporal signatures beyond normal human background chronoton exposure, biological readings consistent with someone who'd spent time in various time streams without suffering permanent temporal damage. All perfectly, reassuringly normal. Then he stepped into the TQSA scanning chamber, and Normal decided to file a formal complaint with the universe's management. The machine activated with a sort of self-important harmonic resonance that temporal technology seemed to cultivate as a professional necessity. Quantum phase scanners began analyzing the chronological imprints stored in his cellular structure, cross-referencing temporal trauma markers with the physical evidence of old injuries. For the first 4 to 2 seconds, everything proceeded according to established parameters. Then the scanner encountered a scar along Cole's right temple and promptly began experiencing what could diplomatically be called a temporal identity crisis. The scar itself was hardly remarkable, a thin line that suggested an old impact from something moderately sharp. But the temporal echo embedded in the tissue told a story that made the scanning algorithms question their fundamental understanding of causality. The chronological imprint indicated the injury had occurred during what the subject's temporal signature classified as routine field work, but the associated timestream data suggested the routine work had involved negotiating with an entity that existed across 17 different timelines simultaneously. Minor temporal recalibration in progress, M.Y. Exthol announced, his gaseous form shifting to patterns that indicated mild professional confusion mixed with the sort of concern that suggested expensive equipment wasn't behaving according to specifications. The TQSA systems are simply ensuring comprehensive chronological analysis. The second anomaly made the scanner emit sounds that resembled a clock tower having an existential breakdown while being struck by lightning. This scar, barely visible along Cole's collarbone, contained temporal echoes of an incident the subject's timestream had filed under Tuesday afternoon inconvenience. The chronological analysis, however, indicated exposure to what the database classified as causal inversion trauma, injury patterns that occurred when someone experienced effects before their causes, which was the sort of thing that made temporal physicists reach for strong alcohol and stronger antacids. Dr. Prexander materialized beside the scanning station through the sort of precise spatial displacement that crystalline species used when they wanted to arrive somewhere with maximum dramatic effect. Her form, a complex geometric structure of living crystal that refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, resonated with harmonics that indicated scientific curiosity, rapidly transforming into academic panic. As the complex's chief xenoarchaeologist, she'd analyzed temporal artifacts from thousands of different civilizations, but these readings were systematically violating every principle of chronology she'd spent 4 centuries learning. These temporal echoes are inconsistent with survivable causal experience, she announced, her crystalline structure resonating with frequencies that indicated deep scientific distress. The chronological imprints suggest exposure to temporal conditions that preclude the existence of coherent time streams. The TQSA continued its work, each new discovery more alarming than the last. A mark on Cole's shoulder contained temporal echoes of what the database classified as dimensional folding trauma, chronological damage that occurred when someone's personal timeline was temporarily stored in nonlinear time. Another scar held timestream patterns indicating survival in environments where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, which was the sort of thing that gave temporal philosophers nightmares and made causality experts update their resumes. How exactly dangerous is human archaeological work? MYX Thole asked, his gaseous form now shifting through colors that suggested his species' equivalent of deeply concerned hyperventilation. It's mostly pretty routine, Cole replied, his tone carrying the casual honesty of someone discussing weather patterns. Though we do occasionally encounter unusual temporal phenomena during field work. The scanner was now accessing the Historical Threat Registry, a comprehensive database of dangerous temporal entities that had been compiled over 5 millennia of galactic civilization, making increasingly expensive mistakes with time travel. Each scar was being cross-referenced against known chronological hazard signatures, and the results were painting a picture that made veteran temporal security professionals reach for their emergency meditation protocols. A barely visible mark across Cole's knuckles matched the temporal signature of something the registry identified as the Time Eater, a cosmic entity that had been responsible for the complete chronological erasure of the Andromeda Galaxy's entire history approximately 3,000 years ago. Official reports described it as a force that could metabolize temporal energy directly, consuming entire timelines as casual snacks. Direct contact was considered theoretically impossible, since the entity existed by definition in moments that had never occurred. I need you to explain this particular temporal echo, Dr. Prexander said, her crystalline structure now resonating with harmonics that indicated scientific fascination wrestling with temporal sanity. Cole glanced at his knuckles with a mild interest of someone checking for ink stains. Oh, that one. Yeah, excavation in the chrono sector went a bit sideways. Ran into that entity while it was having what I assume was breakfast. Turned out to be more curious than hostile. You encountered the Time Eater during active temporal feeding and retained chronological coherence. MYX Thole's gaseous form was now cycling through color patterns that indicated his species had no adequate emotional response for this level of temporal impossibility. Well, I wouldn't say I retained much coherence. Spent about a week experiencing last Tuesday on repeat while simultaneously remembering events that hadn't happened yet. Very disorienting. Had to reschedule several excavation permits. The scanning chamber was rapidly becoming the most popular destination in the Apex verification complex. Word traveled through the facility's communication networks with the efficiency of information that was simultaneously fascinating and temporally threatening. Security personnel from various departments had found increasingly creative reasons to pass by Chamber Epsilon, ostensibly checking on routine procedures, but actually trying to witness whatever was causing the most advanced temporal scanning systems to have public chronological breakdowns. The TQSA scanner, meanwhile, was beginning to display symptoms of what could only be described as temporal trauma. Its chronological analysis algorithms were cycling through timestream patterns that violated basic assumptions about causality, survival, and the general reliability of linear time. Burns from contact with crystallized temporal energy. Chronological scars from conversations with entities that existed in negative time. Evidence of maintaining human cognitive function in environments where consciousness was required to experience past, present, and future simultaneously. Arbiter Next Void manifested in the scanning chamber through the sort of coordinated energy discharge that collective consciousness entities use to express administrative urgency. Their form, a swirling vortex of organized electromagnetic patterns that hurt to perceive directly, pulsed with frequencies that indicated collective concern approaching panic levels. As the complex's primary administrative consciousness, they'd process their share of unusual temporal permits, but this particular situation was approaching scales that exceeded their considerable bureaucratic processing power. What is the precise nature of this chronological anomaly? They inquired, their collective voice harmonizing in temporal frequencies that made nearby clock mechanisms run backwards. MYXTHOL gestured at the scanner displays, which were now showing temporal patterns that appeared to exist in several different timeline configurations simultaneously. The human archaeologist appears to have survived direct encounters with entities that our chronology classifies as temporally unsurvivable threats. Multiple encounters, Dr. Prexander added, her crystalline resonance now producing harmonics that existed in theoretical time rather than actual time. The temporal trauma patterns suggest exposure to at least 19 different chronological hazards. The probability of surviving even one such encounter approaches temporal impossibility. The scanner chose that moment to identify another temporal echo cluster, this one associated with a scar so faint it was barely visible along Cole's jawline. The readout caused several nearby temporal security personnel to emit distress calls that existed backwards in time. The chronological patterns indicated exposure to something the database classified as living nebula dissolution class temporal, survival contact with sentient gas clouds that existed by dissolving other forms of matter across multiple timelines. Living nebula. Arbiter Next Void asked, their energy patterns shifting to configurations that indicated collective temporal bewilderment. Research expedition in the Helix sector, Cole explained helpfully. Encountered a nebula that turned out to be less of a gas cloud and more of a, well, let's call it a really big temporal entity with strong opinions about solid matter existing in its personal space. The crowd of observers had grown to include most of the complex's temporal staff. The Altarian historical delegation was recording everything for what they claimed were research purposes, but were obviously planning to sell as temporal entertainment media. The Centauran Archaeological Corps was performing calculations on portable chronometer computers, presumably trying to update their temporal risk assessment protocols for human contact. Even the normally stoic maintenance drones had begun clustering around the scanner chamber, their sensors apparently finding the situation worth temporal documentation. The TQSA scanner was now operating at the theoretical limits of its chronological design parameters, accessing temporal archives that required cosmic-level security clearances to even acknowledge existed in any timeline. Each temporal echo analysis revealed another impossibility, chronological trauma from weapons that existed only in theoretical time travel papers, temporal memories of impacts that should have scattered consciousness across multiple centuries, and strangest of all, recollections of maintaining human stubbornness in situations where stubbornness itself shouldn't be temporally possible. Your species' temporal survival capabilities must represent extraordinary chronological evolution, Dr. Prexander observed, her crystalline structure now resonating at frequencies that existed in theoretical mathematics rather than actual physics. Not really, Cole replied. Mostly we just tell time-related problems to stop being so complicated until they give up and become manageable. It works more often than you'd expect. The scanner was now displaying what appeared to be a complex temporal equation that existed across several different timeline possibilities simultaneously. The mathematics cascaded through chronological probability matrices that violated fundamental principles of causality, finally resolving into what might have been a question if questions were allowed to exist in 17 different temporal states at once. Then the machine produced a query that would eventually require the establishment of an entirely new field of temporal philosophy to properly analyze. Priority alpha chronological classification required. Her subject maintained biological and temporal coherence following direct confrontational contact with deity-class entities possessing timeline manipulation capabilities exceeding galactic temporal scale parameters. The scanning chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of temporal stabilization systems, and the distant sound of Arbiter Next Void's energy patterns crackling with chronological anxiety. Cole read the question with the sort of patient interest one might show when reviewing excavation regulations. That's extremely specific, he noted. Though I guess it depends on what you mean by confrontational contact. Direct temporal conflict or chronological negotiation with entities possessing power over fundamental time stream constants, MYX provided. His gaseous form now resembling a sunset painted by someone having a temporal anxiety attack. And deity class? Dr. Prexander consulted her databases with the mechanical precision of someone whose chronological training was the only thing preventing complete temporal psychological collapse. Entities demonstrating influence over time itself, causal manipulation beyond known chronophysics, or direct control over concepts such as temporal existence and causality flow. Ah, Cole nodded thoughtfully. In that case, yes. Though confrontational might be overstating it. More of a professional disagreement about temporal ethics that escalated beyond normal chronological parameters. The assembled crowd of complex personnel had grown to include representatives from most major galactic temporal authorities. Emergency temporal communication protocols were being quietly activated as various civilizations' time travel monitoring services began receiving reports about potential contact with timeline-threatening entities. The Altarian temporal ambassador was already composing messages that would give his superiors chronological crises that would last across multiple timeline iterations. Could you describe the nature of this temporal disagreement? Arbiter Nexvoid asked, their energy patterns now creating small temporal distortions that made nearby clocks run at different speeds. Cole settled into the tone of someone explaining a minor workplace incident that had gotten slightly out of chronological hand. There was this entity that had decided our local time stream would make an excellent addition to its temporal art collection. Called itself something that roughly translates to the curator of inevitable chronologies, very pretentious naming conventions for something that existed across all possible timelines simultaneously. It showed up one Thursday and started rearranging historical events to improve what it called temporal aesthetic balance. The scanner had abandoned any pretense of normal temporal operation and was now simply displaying messages in chronolex that predated most current mathematical concepts. Emergency systems that existed in theoretical time began activating throughout the complex, creating a symphony of warnings and temporal frequencies that made local causality develop philosophical concerns. The entity decided our timeline was slightly off balance relative to its artistic vision, Cole continued, apparently oblivious to the growing temporal panic around him. So it started editing historical events, which was inconvenient for archaeological research, since it kept changing the artifacts I was supposed to be studying. And you objected to historical revision? Dr. Prexander asked, her crystalline structure now resembling a temporal disco ball having a chronological nervous breakdown. Well, I had research deadlines to meet. So I asked if we could maybe discuss alternative artistic approaches that didn't involve rewriting the past. MYX was now maintaining his gaseous form through what appeared to be sheer force of will and professional determination. How did you resolve the temporal situation? It challenged me to what it called a contest of chronological significance to determine whether our timeline deserved to remain in its current historical configuration. Turned out to be something like competitive temporal archaeology, but performed with actual historical events as research materials. Very high stakes. Also, surprisingly educational. You engaged in competitive temporal archaeology with a reality-manipulating cosmic entity using actual history as research data. Arbiter Nexvoid's collective consciousness had reached harmonics that were causing temporal vibrations in the complex's chronological stabilization systems. More like collaborative historical research with past, present, and future as academic resources. The entity was actually quite knowledgeable about pre-galactic civilizations. We worked together for about 8 months of subjective time to develop a comprehensive understanding of temporal archaeological methodology. 8 months of collaborative cosmic temporal research, Dr. Prexander repeated, her voice carrying the hollow resonance of someone whose understanding of academic collaboration had been thoroughly temporally redefined. The final research presentation was quite impressive. We called it Comprehensive Analysis of Causal Archaeological Methodology Across Multiple Timeline Configurations. Got excellent peer reviews from other cosmic entities working in temporal studies. The TQSA scanner had apparently reached the absolute limits of its chronological programming and was now displaying what appeared to be a request for emergency temporal philosophical consultation. Alarms that existed in theoretical time began sounding throughout the complex, creating acoustic patterns that hurt to contemplate across multiple timeline possibilities. Perhaps, Cole suggested over the growing symphony of bureaucratic temporal panic, we could expedite this process. I do have an archaeological permit to collect, and the Kepler sector temporal anomalies won't study themselves. Arbiter Nextvoid looked at him with a collective expression of entities who'd just realized they were trying to contain a cosmic temporal force with filing procedures and chronological optimism. You know what, Lieutenant? I think we can make a special exception to our standard temporal security protocols. The scanner protested this decision with sounds that resembled several different types of time experiencing technical difficulties simultaneously, but Arbiter Nextvoid was already overriding its systems with a determined efficiency of beings who decided that some temporal problems exceeded the boundaries of reasonable chronological administrative response. The alarms gradually faded into blessed temporal silence. The emergency systems returned to their normal, non-apocalyptic chronological configurations. The various temporal authority representatives began dispersing with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed something that would require the invention of new fields of temporal study to properly analyze. Welcome to Apex Verification Complex, Lieutenant Vanguard, Arbiter Nextvoid said, their energy patterns still flickering with Bella-controlled frequencies of temporal anxiety. We trust your archaeological research will proceed without further chronological complications. Oh, I'm sure it will be perfectly routine, Cole replied, collecting his temporal permits and heading toward the complex's main archaeological transit hub. Though you might want to have someone recalibrate that scanner. I think it's developed some kind of chronological anxiety disorder. As he walked away, the TQSA scanner displayed one final message: subject departed. Requesting immediate temporal hardware replacement, chronological software complete overhaul, and comprehensive psychiatric evaluation for temporal electronic systems. Also, please update security classifications to include chronological significance, threat levels for future temporal reference. Dr. Prexander stared at the display for several chronologically extended minutes before beginning to draft a research proposal that would either revolutionize galactic understanding of temporal consciousness and causality, or result in her being committed to an asylum for delusional crystalline beings suffering from chronic temporal exposure. The proposal's working title was Why Human Temporal Stubbornness Appears to Violate Causal Laws, a comprehensive study in applied chronological impossibility. MYXthol, meanwhile, was already composing the temporal security report that would eventually become so chronologically classified that accessing it would require permission from entities that existed beyond conventional timestream parameters. The report's executive summary could be condensed to a single temporal observation. Humans appeared to be too practically minded to be defeated by chronological horror, treating timeline-threatening entities as minor temporal inconveniences to be resolved through polite academic collaboration and professional archaeological standards. And somewhere in the complex's archaeological research sector, Lieutenant Cole Vanguard was finally getting down to the serious business of completing his permit applications, wondering why everyone seemed so surprised that he was still temporally coherent. After all, chronological survival wasn't particularly complicated. You just had to be willing to have reasonable academic discussions with unreasonable temporal forces and maintain professional archaeological standards even when your research materials included actual historical causality and collaborative timeline manipulation. The coffee in the archaeological sector was decent, which was really the most important consideration for maintaining professional standards during routine temporal research operations involving potentially universe-threatening chronological anomalies.